Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the strange new respect for Marjorie Taylor Greene, the UK Labour Party's plan to limit migration, and why Ashley Frawley, our very own, opposes the Vatican returning indigenous artifacts to indigenous people. I'm joined by Ashley Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So Marjorie Taylor Greene is the hot new thing after a long career of talking about Jewish space lasers and generally being viewed as the most crankish of prominent Trump supporters. She's now the toast of mainstream media. David French at the New York Times is signaling his happiness at her new turn and saying he's praying for her. She's going on the news channels and getting respectful interviews. Geoff, what's behind Marjorie Taylor Greene's star turn?
Well, part of this is a familiar phenomenon, which is that whichever political party you're affiliated with, when you can find people in the other party or who have a long association with the other party, the deeper in it, the better, who are willing to criticize it and particularly criticize its figureheads and leading figures, then that person is going to provide a kind of catnip for opposition media. So we've seen plenty of examples of this. I think maybe Ashley and I would even sort of would have to cop to being a little bit exemplary of this, people who have some kind of historical affiliation with the left. And if you're willing to criticize the left, then people on the right love to hear from you. They can't get enough of you. So I'm not saying either of us are.
And I can't get enough of you, Geoff. So
people. Obviously, I'm not saying either of us are of the grand stature of someone like of a commanding figure like Marjorie Taylor Greene. But it's clearly just an example of that phenomenon. We could find many much more prominent ones of sort of left-wing figures who became very popular on the right. One who comes to mind who shares a certain amount of crankishness with Marjorie Taylor Greene would actually be RFK Jr., who was a Democrat in decent standing not that long ago, but for various reasons fell out with his party over different things and eventually became a beloved figure within the MAGA right, despite not having, as far as I know, explicitly changed his positions on a lot of the things that made him a sort of standard issue Democrat. I think he's sort of moderated or tempered a bit on, say, abortion, but for the most part, he is still apparently policy-wise not particularly aligned with MAGA, but he nonetheless is now deep in the inner sanctum of it because of his willingness to attack his former fellow Democrats. And so MTG seems to be following, in a smaller way, a version of this arc. There's been sort of a reconciliation between her and Trump in the past day or two. So we'll see how all this evolves, which seems to go along with Trump's decision to give the green light on releasing the Epstein files. So it seems that Trump is actually sort of making concessions to this faction within the party that is particularly angry at him over the Epstein phenomenon, and his sort of shift from trying to make a big deal of it to claiming that it's a hoax and trying to brush it aside. And so clearly on one level, her new valorization on the left is kind of a piece, or among Democrats, is kind of a piece with the way that the Epstein story has become catnip for Democrats and sort of resistance liberals recently. specifically because they think they can tie Trump to it and make use of the fact that he has been reluctant to release any of these materials as a way of sort of trying to drive a wedge into his coalition. So, I think it's an interesting phenomenon. So beyond the sort of this basic phenomenon by which if you find an internal critic on the other side, you're always going to elevate that person. I suppose what's interesting here is the question of whether there's going to be, or whether there are signs of a kind of MAGA crack up. In other words, whether the coalition is going to eventually fracture. And clearly the Epstein thing so far has been the clearest source of genuine internal friction with and a sort of a genuine, seeming kind of coalitional crisis for Trump that he had not faced previously for some time. So obviously the thing that again has the kind of liberals sort of chomping at the bit is the idea that this will drive a wedge deep into the MAGA coalition and cause some of these former true believers to become disillusioned and peel off. And it is interesting that you have a sort of small subset of a small subset of media figures who, might turn out to become the kind of leading edge of a certain disillusionment, or might not. It's kind of unclear. I'm thinking of someone like Pedro Gonzalez, who's written for Compact in the past, who it was a sort of MAGA figure, was also then a kind of Ron DeSantis supporter, and in various ways kind of has become a major kind of internal critic of MAGA on the right. There are a number of other kind of relatively small and somewhat kind of highbrow pundits of the sort who have in various ways become disillusioned. So I think one interesting question is whether there are clearly many things you can point to and say Trump seems to have betrayed this or that constituency, seems to have failed to fulfill this or that promise, seems to not be serious. So like there's no lack of things that you can point to on policy substance, but obviously because of its salacious tabloidy nature, the Epstein story is just more enticing material than whether he's doing things that harm like American farmers. That's never going to be quite sort of soybean or corn. The fate of like soybean and corn farmers is never going to be quite as exciting as goings on in a Upper East Side townhouse involving various celebrities. So I think that's really what's going on here. I haven't said as much about Marjorie Taylor Greene herself, but I think the RFK comparison is maybe the most relevant because you have sort of a prominent figure who's deeply identified with a coalition, who's also kind of kooky and eccentric in various ways, and I don't think that Marjorie Taylor Greene at this point is likely to kind of go in an RFK direction, but you can at least see a certain I think she will ultimately remain in the MAGA camp, but you can see a kind of parallel to that phenomenon. And I do think, again, the question is whether this is a leading edge of some sort of crack up within the coalition, which seems unclear to me as of yet, but clearly that's what a lot of people are thinking and wondering about. And because she's a figure who came up in and through this whole QAnon generation of political figures who whose career was kind of only made possible by Trump. She's a particularly enticing figure. She's not a kind of standard issue Republican who jumped on board with Trump when it turned out to be convenient. She's somebody who really couldn't have risen except, through the sort of path that he carved out. So, it is an interesting moment. I don't, again, expect to see her do a full kind of 180 or anything like that. But I think it does raise questions about whether this coalition, which seems so sort of ironclad in a lot of ways, does have fractures that could eventually break it up.
If anything would, it would be this particular issue because it's so core to what makes Trump and his whole following, what made it so powerful. Because he's supposed to be like associated with transparency. He positioned himself as against the deep state. As I've said many times before, part of Trump's magic is that he seems to be the kind of person that couldn't keep a secret to save his life because he just talks, right? So him suddenly putting up this wall and very clearly being evasive strikes at the heart of the whole brand, because now he's part, this is being concerned about the Epstein files is completely, as you said, consistent with this kind of conspiratorial thinking, this sort of crankishness, the QAnon stuff, the idea of like large human trafficking networks, and Trump suddenly not going along with this, not saying, I'm going to be the person who's going to bring transparency, who's going to tell you what's really been going on behind the scenes. All of a sudden, he seems to be one of them. He becomes a kind of turncoat. So it was one of the few things that could really be damaging to, I don't know about Trump's movement. I mean, there's certain people that will always kind of go along with him to the bitter end, but it was probably the only thing that was capable of really hurting his brand.
Yeah, I tend to view this incident as reflecting the limits of the populist style that has powered Trumpism in part, and that is a style that's concerned with conspiracies of elites. It's very skeptical of institutions, and it tends toward theories of far-reaching conspiracies of sex trafficking and blackmail. Marjorie Taylor Greene clearly buys into this to a great extent, and I think that the Trump phenomenon drew some strength from those suspicious conspiratorial energies, and it's now suffering some of the consequences from it. I also just want to remark on the convergence between figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene and other figures who are regarded as highly respectable and really her kind of ideological and dispositional opposites. People like Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts or Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut. These are kind of your New York Times, Ezra Klein type candidates who are conversant in all of the up-to-date conversations and have the right degrees or at least are adjacent to the correct institutions. Well, they're also very concerned with the Epstein thing, and what we're seeing here is just the working out of something that I began to argue this past summer and on my podcast Against the Grain. Please go there and subscribe to it if you haven't, and also in an article for First Things magazine. And that's the way in which the Epstein case has successfully synthesized two distinct strands of American paranoia. And one is the Me Too scandal, which was taken up, especially by liberal institutions, though it had really broad public purchase. And the Me Too moment was really powered by the belief that one had to believe women, and also that there was a kind of entrenched sexism operating in these institutions, that there were sort of rape myths powering society that rendered the regular operation of jury trials unreliable. And so you had to kind of tell people, well, set aside things like statutes of limitation, set aside general evidentiary standards, set aside due process, and we have to get this conviction. So that was the kind of the Me Too paranoia. And then you had, really arising in tandem with it and seemingly totally opposed to it, QAnon. And QAnon had its own Baroque theory of kind of victimizing class and innocent victims. And the victimizing class were these kind of globalist, kind of Jewish-coded elites who harvested adrenochrome, harvested this kind of life-giving substance from young people in a kind of reprise of classic anti-Semitic blood libels. Well, the Epstein case simply synthesizes QAnon and Me Too. It takes a kind of general feminist sense that there are powerful men who are abusing vulnerable young women, and it combines that with the kind of QAnon sense that, well, these aren't just kind of random men who are being sexist, but they're also part of this kind of global network. Maybe it's tied to Israeli intelligence, maybe to something else, and it's also specifically exploiting underage people. So it has this pedophilic component. It's feeding on young flesh. And the synthesis of these two theories of QAnon and Me Too is represented in sociological terms by the political convergence of an Elizabeth Warren who has, called successfully for Larry Summers to step back from his public life over his Epstein connections. The convergence between Elizabeth Warren and Marjorie Taylor Greene. So I think that the Epstein case should be understood as an extension of wokeness in a certain way. Like wokeness, it kind of theorizes a victim class and a victimizing class. Like wokeness, it has tended to kind of tread underfoot, due process and kind of factual standards. But it also represents a genuine advance of sorts over wokeness, if you want to call it that, and that it sort of incorporates its seeming opposite of this kind of paranoid QAnon, which was, kind of pioneered by MAGA patriots or whatever on 4chan, who presumably would have been totally opposed to this woke nonsense and this feminazi inspiration, but behind Me Too or whatever. It just incorporates that. It just it folds these two things together and into a kind of a bigger, grander theory. And it's a theory that doesn't just explain predatory relationships within American institutions, but it explains a way in which a kind of foreign cabal is preying on the United States and distorting our foreign policy. So it's a quite impressive ideological construction. It has a lot of different uses, and I don't think it's going away anytime soon.
I've been joking that I guess my version of that has been, I've been joking about to my friends about the 2028 AOC MTG split ticket, unity ticket. So that's where this the sort of woke QAnon convergence cashes out politically.
Yeah. Campaign slogan: "Believe women." I can see kind of, I don't know, MTG kind of crying next to I don't know, some site where Trump has betrayed the MAGA cause, as this kind of chain link fence, as AOC once did, to the delight of people who make memes on Twitter. In the UK,
it could be one of those when they sort of discover those child trafficking sites. It could be like she could be weeping in front of this child trafficking site that Trump failed to bring to justice or something.
Yeah, she'll. We need, and then after they're elected, they'll kind of celebrate annual Trans Day of Remembrance at the site of Comet Pizza or whatever. They'll keep synthesizing and combining these seemingly opposed kind of cultural causes. In the UK, Shabana Mahmood, Labour official overseeing migration, has said it's not far right, it's not racist, it's not bad to say that migration is a problem, and the Labour government is taking steps to limit it. Ashley, have you been paying much attention to what's going on there? Is the Labour government threatening to strip you of your right to be in the UK, or have things not reached that point yet.
Oh, well, actually, it's a little bit concerning. The talk of that Nigel Farage was putting forward about indefinite leave to remain, sort of people who thought they were safe kind of started getting a little bit worried. But I think some of the discussion about this is so difficult because it is so easy to put all of the anger on migrants when a lot of people come to the UK perfectly legally and have respect for their surroundings and their adoptive country. But the fact remains that migration, as I've said many times before, has been used as a way of avoiding tackling deep infrastructural issues, lack of opportunity, lack of economic growth. There's been a push for fuel economic growth through crappy service sector jobs that are being filled by migrant labor. And they're addicted to this migrant labor. They love it. It's mobile, it's cheap, it's desperate. Not always. It's obviously migration happens at every social class, but we've had pieces in Compact before that have laid bare the fact that at every level of every position, from professional all the way down, those in power have been in love with migration because they don't have to pay for people to go have an education. They get educated in their home countries. They come in working years. You can use them up, toss them out, especially if they come on short-term visas. That's the ideal. That's what you really want. And local grown people ask for too much. So people will often retort, well, migrants come and they do jobs that you won't do. You always hear that. But of course they won't do, it's that you won't do at the going rate. You will do a crappy job if the pay is enough, but the pay is very poor usually. So I don't know if all of this talk is sincere or if it's just a way of trying to dampen down the threat from reform. I don't see any realistic attempt to shake the UK from any country, really. This is not a problem. This sort of lack of economic growth is not a problem specific to the UK. I don't see people really having a plan to shake the country out of its stupor. Every time that there is discussion of the budget, there's, well, we're going to do this. And then somebody gets mad and they're like, oh, yeah, we won't do that. They're just absolutely terrified of taking any kinds of risks. So migration has been this kind of stopgap. And they were able to do it because for a long time, they sort of confined the Overton window to such a tiny little area of discussion that you simply could not question it. So they got away with it for so long. They don't actually have another plan. And one of the thing that has caused a bunch of controversy in the past couple of days are all these announcements about refugees. So, I started out saying that a lot of anger is being sort of directed toward migration for all of these reasons. It's people sense that it's being used to drive down wages, that it's being used as a way to evade deeper questions, to evade taking risks with actually trying to grow the economy, to build infrastructure, to do larger projects. But particularly among working class communities, there's a lot of anger about the weird, strange system that has developed where instead of processing refugee claims, they were just stacking people away in these hotels. And then you just have a ton of men, nothing to do. And they're causing a lot of social disorder. They have different kinds of norms and they're bored. This is this is not rocket science. A lot of young men with nothing to do is a problem in any country, anywhere you go, regardless of whether or not they're migrants. So there was some announcements over the last couple of days that there would be a harsher strategy on refugees, that the initial grant of refugee status would only last 2.5 years instead of 5. There was talk of, this hard talk of like, we need to deport families, because what winds up happening is you have if you have children in the UK, then it makes it very, very difficult to deport somebody because of the Convention on Human Rights and the right to family life, this sort of thing. But I don't think actually any of this talk over the last couple of days about refugee reforms will actually bear any fruits. I think it is a bandage to try to stave off the threat of reform, because they do not want to countenance the idea of leaving the Convention on Human Rights, because it's going to cause all these problems with Northern Ireland and so on. But, Brexit was similar. It was going to cause all these problems, and it did cause a whole bunch of problems because the people who were overseeing it were dragged kicking and screaming too. It wasn't seen as an opportunity. It was like, God, now what do we do? But, there was a demand for government and that was executed by people who don't want to govern. So you have these people who are, we're still in this kind of situation. They're making all these promises, but they don't want to leave this convention. And so they can't actually do anything about this. Cases are still going to be taken out of the UK to be adjudicated. And that is part of the big issue. That's why you have these people that get stuck in the system, because there's an enormous industry, a humongous industry of lawyers and NGOs and so on who identify cases, who take these. They know exactly what to do. They know how to get people to stay in the UK. They know you've got all these lawyers who are like, you feeling bad right now? Good. We're going to call that like this thing. That means that you are experiencing exceptional, they're very, very good at coaching people. It is a huge industry, and it's not just here. You see this all over the place, and it makes it very, very difficult to do anything, because it's just people's day job to scupper governments and when they actually do attempt to do things. Now, don't get me wrong. I do understand that a lot of these NGOs are driven by good intentions. I too weep when I hear the stories about people drowning in the Channel. It's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. And so, yeah, they're driven. A lot of them are driven by good intentions. But at the end of the day, when you have an incentive for people to cross, that you're gonna, life in a hotel even is better than where you're coming from. If you have lack of opportunity and so on, people are going to do it. And now they're talking about paying people like at least £3,000. I think they already do that, but they're going to up it, £5,000, £7,000 to pay people to leave the country, pay people to accept deportation. So if you're coming from zero prospects, enough that you're willing to risk your life by crossing the Channel, you're going to get paid regardless on the other side. I guess I'm sort of downplaying the degree to which people are willing to risk their lives for such a small payout, but it just does seem like you've got nothing to lose. You have even less to lose with all of these, what the government is trying to say about what they're going to try to do about this problem. And they just cannot seem to deter people from crossing the Channel. They just cannot seem to deter people from claiming refugee status. And obviously these people know exactly how to work the system, because there are tons and tons of people whose job it is to help them work the system. So none of this is going to work. There's a much, much bigger, and I would say this, as a sociologist, but there's obviously a much bigger thing going on in terms of global inequality and push factors and blah, blah, blah. These tiny little tweaks and promises and, we're going to move it down to this many years and we're going to give this much money. We'll give a little bit more money, but we're definitely not going to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. It means that it's all words. If they've really wanted to do something about it, then they would commit to leaving the convention, I think. And they're not willing to do that, which means that it's all political and it's about just trying to evade the threat from reform, in my opinion.
One way they could stop it is by refusing to accept anyone who comes by small boats. I think, Tony Abbott, when he was the leader of Australia, had some success with that when he faced a similar situation. But it sounds as though the labor measures will certainly stop short of stemming the tide and maybe create more confusion among those who have arrived. Still, I think it's just a profound sign of how the politics of this are shifting. And yes, certainly labor is feeling the heat from reform. But Ashley, why do you oppose something as benign seeming as the Vatican returning indigenous artifacts to indigenous people. You wrote an article for Compact this week. Aren't we Catholic too? You're a member of the Nipissing First Nation. I'm sure that pronunciation was flawless.
No, that's right.
So, yeah, can you just share your thoughts on this with our listeners?
Sure, yeah. So I was just sort of flicking through the news as you do, and I came across this story on Saturday, so 15th of November, where the Vatican said that it had handed back 62 cultural artifacts to I can't remember the name of the organization, Canadian Bishops of Canada, something like that. And then the bishops are going to try to hand them back to the communities. But it's been 100 years, and it's actually not quite certain where these artifacts actually came. But it really bothered me. It really, really bothered me because some of my fondest memories, and this has been really formative for me, and I started the piece with this as well, is like sitting in my grandma's living room, praying the rosary with tobacco in our hands. And how my grandparents would go to church, I think almost daily, and they would go to any church. Like they didn't just go to Catholic church, wherever we were. They just went to church. They're like, oh, here's a church. We're welcome here. And they just go in. I remember we went to like a Black people church once. I shouldn't say that in that way, but the people were all like shouting in the pews. And my grandma just sort of looked around and she started shouting too. She was like, amen, this sort of thing. And I always thought about that as like, I mean, syncretism is a powerful aspect of, spreading religion, that sort of thing. But I always felt like how powerful a universalist lesson that was, that like if we were Christian, we were all kind of the same. Even if you were like Black, or even if you were, and my grandmother married a white man, and he would smudge with us, and because he was an orphan. I've told this story before on this podcast, so I shouldn't go into detail, but he was an orphan and was taken in by my grandmother's parents when he was a bit older. And he was like fully native. Like he would go, like he would just disappear into the woods for like days on end. And that was, and I have always bristled at this turn where it's like, no, indigenous culture is just ours. It's just ours. And so now I see, I follow these pages from Nipissing First Nation or like First Nation stuff on Facebook. And it's like, oh, new fashion collection from this indigenous designer. And she's adamant that it's only for Native people. It's not for white people. And I'm like, what? And that person is bowing to pressure because pretty much zero people want that to happen. Because like my aunt, for instance, has a Native craft shop on our reserve. And she makes really beautiful stuff. And it's on the highway going into Sudbury. Who's she going to sell to? Just the reserve is like, saturated. She wants to sell to the people driving down the highway. But I bought a beautiful pair of mucklucks. I freaking love these mucklucks. And I was wearing them from her. And I was wearing them when I was giving a lecture in the UK. And one of my students came up to me and looked at the mucklucks and gave me the side eye. And I was like, oh, I'm Indigenous First Nations. And he goes, oh, okay. Like I have to do like a blood test before I can wear these. Like that is so backwards. So this really bothered me. I was like, why are you giving these artifacts back, saying like, oh, we're beginning to atone for the destruction of culture and so on? Is that not my culture? Is Catholicism not my culture? So then all these memories that I have, all these fond memories of going to church and praying the rosary and so on, I was just a dupe. My grandmother's just a dupe of colonization. She has no agency. My grandparents had no agency. And that's the message. And like, that was what the commentary was all saying about this. It was like, well, the Vatican's official story is that these were given as gifts, but given the complex power dynamics of colonization, can we really say that they were gifts? Okay, given the complex power of colonization, do any of us have agency? No, apparently not. Apparently not. We've become infantilized. And I utterly reject the idea that I love Ojibwe culture. I think it's really beautiful. I want to share it with you. I want you also to hear about my dreams about thunderbirds, even though you don't want to hear about it. I want you also to wear our beautiful beaded moccasins. I think it's beautiful, but it only ever goes one way. It only ever goes one way. We become perpetually outsiders. We become the other forever and ever and ever. We can't share in the wonderful arts and culture of humanity. It's just for ours. We're just for us. We're always on the outside. And I always remember that famous Frantz Fanon quote where he says, but I am a man. And in that sense, the Peloponnesian War is as much mine as the, now I've forgotten the quote, as the compass, right? Ojibwe culture is as much yours as Aristotle and Plato are mine, because I am a human. We are all humans. We share in the good stuff, but we also share in the horrors, the terrible things that we've done, colonization. That's yours and that's mine also. Mine also because I'm mixed. So like, even if you wouldn't be able to like figure out which part of my DNA was responsible for colonizing the other part, like it doesn't even make any sense. There's all this melding and so on. But I have always really felt that there was something powerful about the Catholic idea, the idea of Katholiki being meaning universal, that there was this aspiration for something universal, that even when these missionaries called my ancestors savages, they still thought, you have a soul just like I do, and that can be saved. Within that racism, there's actually a rational universalist kernel that says you are part of the human family. And I think this kind of thing, it steps it back. It says, you're not part of this family. You're not part of the Catholic Church. You're just a victim. You don't move with history. You were destroyed by history several hundred years ago, and you're still there. And we're going to fix all your problems if we could just somehow go back to that mystical Garden of Eden, where everything was right. It was like, and I talk about this in a paper called "Supporting the Sacred Journey," which I linked in the compact piece, where it's like all these stories of the problems that affect Indigenous people. They're always like, there's always this fall. It's like the fall. They depict this idyllic world before the fall of colonization. Everything was great. You were just exactly what you were supposed to be, and then colonizers came and they stole your culture. No, I mean, first of all, this is cultural deprivation theory, which is mostly discredited when it comes to anybody else. Like, we don't say like Black people don't have culture. They absolutely do. Indigenous people do have culture. Culture wasn't lost in the past. Everybody, all human beings have culture, and we bring things together. We syncretize. We move forward. All human beings do this. But Indigenous people, their culture is frozen in like the 15th century. And the solution to all our problems, like culture becomes this kind of therapy. Once we give you back your culture, then we will solve your problems. Then we will solve. It's this magical solution. And these giving back artifacts is this symbolism of this magical solution. We're going to give you back your culture. Then somehow, some way, the infrastructural problems, the lack of employment, lack of job opportunities, the distance from mainstream society, that's just all going to disappear. And you cannot question that narrative. It's like this Indigenous healing crap that is like so magical, so ridiculous. It just psychologizes people. It turns people into perpetual victims, and it's just everywhere. I think I've said this where my sister said, I was like, oh, Tamara, why do you have these problems? And she's like, well, Ashley, we never learned to be mothers. And it's just like a cliche that everybody says, because of the disruption of colonization, we never learned to be mothers. And I was like, our mother's white. Like, what are you even on about? But everybody repeats it. They repeat it. And it just becomes like, Krista Maxwell, in this wonderful paper, she did these interviews. And one of her respondents said, we're all damaged. Our parents were damaged. We're damaged. And so our children are damaged. And so it will go on and on. That's what she said. So it will go on and on. That's it. Intergenerational trauma becomes this magical causal story that explains absolutely everything. No, I don't think so. Indigenous people have the exact same problems as every other poor group on Earth. And when you're not poor, magically, you don't have those problems anymore. Amazing. Amazing how that works. Sorry, that's my rant about why I hated these artifacts. I am Catholic too. The Catholic Church is part of my culture. I wasn't damaged by it. We we perfectly were able to pray the rosary and go on vision quests, and it deepened our relationship with God, relationship to our ancestors, our relationship to Rome. And I wish that the Vatican would understand that we're part of that family too. We're part of the church.
I am also indigenous. I'm kind of an indigenous European, or at least the idea that a white guy can have an indigenous identity has gained traction over the last 20 years or so on parts of the kind of fringe right. And you see, the new right in Europe, people like Alain de Benoit or Dominique Venner, who killed himself at the altar of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. They've really mounted an argument that the introduction of Christianity to Europe kind of weakened and corrupted European civilization and a European spirit. So it's interesting, the argument that I think has much broader acceptance when it comes to something like First Nations or Indians in North America. Kind of funny enough, it has a certain purchase and more fringe, but not entirely kind of incoherent in terms of the argument they're making. Parts of the European right. So, someone who's also a Christian and a Catholic, and who thinks there is a common humanity, and we don't. I don't just have to consume certain things because they have a kind of more or less real tie to my ancestors. I'm pretty skeptical of those ideas when they're offered by the by people like the European New Right, and I think your piece is a really righteous response to the way in which a lot of our mainstream institutions have accepted them when it comes to kind of indigenous people in the Americas.
So it put me in the mind of something I wrote back in graduate school that I published as an academic paper, and it was about the sort of discovery of Machu Picchu, specifically as a kind of it's archaeological discovery and it's sort of intellectual and literary discovery. And the interesting thing about Machu Picchu is that it was there for hundreds of years. People who lived in that part of Peru knew that it was there. It was just these kind of ruins, on top of this mountain. But, they were just kind of living around there, and they were like, oh, there are those ruins up there. But they didn't consider it a particularly big deal. And I mean, these were indigenous, essentially indigenous people or mestizo people living around there. But they didn't look at Machu Picchu and think this is some deep representation of who we are and our true identity before colonization. They just saw it as this kind of, part of the past, which wasn't particularly interesting. Like there were, people, taking their like sheep and alpacas and stuff up there to graze. Like it was essentially an active, site for animal husbandry. And so the way that this changed, and and it wasn't that these people were deprived of culture. To echo something Ashley said, they had an extremely vibrant, sort of syncretic set of sort of religious beliefs and practices and so on. And that was what they considered to be their culture, to the extent they might talk about it. And that was simply the cultural reality that they lived in. And it was really only when, you had sort of two waves. One, you had Hiram Bingham, the American archaeologist, show up and sort of, quote unquote, discover this. Even though, basically people had known it was there. They just didn't think it was all that notable or interesting. And sort of, he created this huge media event about it. There was a whole issue of National Geographic devoted to his photographs of the site. And he created this whole myth about it being this lost palace of the Incas or lost city of the Incas, which wasn't really true. It was kind of a summer palace that was used by a couple of emperors at a certain point, and then was abandoned because they had lots of other, summer palaces to go to. So the point is, but the thing that interests me here is that then what you had was a subsequent wave of these not indigenous people, but indigenist intellectuals who were largely of European descent, sort of discovering Machu Picchu as a cultural symbol. And so this was the point at which it becomes symbolic of some sort of identity and, some sort of identity at odds with European identity. And so then you have this series of kind of documents that, are varyingly attempts to kind of claim it as a symbol of some sort of autonomous indigenous identity separate from the history and prior to the history of colonization. And it basically borrows the rhetoric that you find in Hiram Bingham's account of it as this kind of untouched virgin site. He literally uses that language, and there's all this language about virginity, and he imagines it as this city that was dwelled in by these like court virgins of the Inca emperors, which is completely made up. But this whole metaphor of virginity becomes that of the indigenous construction of Machu Picchu as well, because the point is it's a virgin site that's untouched by the kind of depredations of European civilization. And so then, these people have sort of been living around there for hundreds of years and just sort of not really considered it that significant to who they were or what their cultural practices were, are suddenly sort of being told, no, this is who you really are, not the things that you're doing. This is who you really are. And they're being told this by essentially sort of, Western educated intellectuals. And so the only kind of interesting, the most notable document that kind of comes out of this, which then pushes in an interesting different direction, which I thought of when Ashley, with Ashley's article, is Neruda's Heights of Machu Picchu, which is an example of this sort of generation of left-wing, intellectuals fantasizing about the sort of untouched indigenous, pre-colonization world. But the interesting thing is that Neruda, when he, in this poem, he ends up kind of dissenting from this vision in a specific way, which is that he, there's sort of this usual tendency to, it's often, it's the idea like, oh, we were, the idea that's often mocked as like, among Afrocentric intellectuals of like, we were kings in Africa or whatever. So like, this is kind of what happens in this indigenism too, that like, everybody is supposed to identify with the Inca emperors. What Neruda realizes is that, actually most people would not have been the emperors. They would have been the people forcibly conscripted into hauling these massive rocks up this hill, many of them dying from the brutal backbreaking labor of doing this. And so he actually, interestingly, sort of produces a different vision in which he imagines, no, there is, there is political struggle, there is class struggle within this society. It was not some kind of pure, untouched realm. And so there's a continuity in the sense that there is still political struggle. There was political struggle between the powerful and the powerless then, and there is now. And so it, I think, even though it's kind of part of this fetishization of Machu Picchu, if you actually read the poem, it interestingly sort of critiques this idea of this, as Ashley said, kind of, prelapsarian, virgin indigenous culture that's somehow untouched by the polluting taint of colonization. And instead it imagines the space as a politically complex one in which there are political struggles, and in which the majority of people are not emperors. The majority of people are, laborers sort of brutalized by the powerful and conscripted into harsh conditions of building these palaces. And so anyway, it was an article I enjoyed writing a long time ago, and I think these issues are every bit as relevant today. And I just want to say in praise of Ashley's article that I think it's attacks these kind of bizarre and ultimately quite sort of racist and primitivist assumptions that infect a lot of thinking on the kind of progressive end of things, that ultimately really end up kind of trying to turn living people into museum pieces, which again is what I think basically these indigenous intellectuals in Peru were doing. They were going to these people and saying, no, like the world that you actually inhabit today isn't real. It's something that's been forced on you. You have to go live in these ruins and recreate this fantasized prelapsarian world. Well, effectively that's telling them, no, you have to go live in a museum. You're essentially, or you need to go kind of live in the equivalent of like a nature reserve. You're not creatures of politics, history, or culture. You're just these kind of emanations of nature, and so you should go back to that.
It's pretty insulting. I am a human just like you, obviously, and so is everybody on the reserve. They like money and pipelines, and they like their culture. It's almost like we're just as complex and capable as anybody else.
Really, listener, go read Ashley's article. We Are Catholic. Are We Not Catholics? At compactmag.com. Subscribe for everything and to support our work. Thanks, Geoff. Thanks, Ashley. And thanks to our producer, Stephen Adebato.